Okay. Sounds like a backdoor way to tether the speaker, but that's okay. Okay, welcome everybody. Can you hear me? Let's see, be sure I've got the, let's back this up. Okay, so Brother Charles, good to see you. We are in Romans 10, but we're going to go back and pick up. You remember when we got to verse 30 in chapter 9, I pointed out that young scribe working in wherever it was that was doing the chapter and verse divisions, don't know what happened, but chapter 10 begins at chapter 9, verse 30 in terms of what the thought is about. So we're going to go back, pick that up, make sure we're on track for what has happened, and then we're going to spend a lot of our time tonight focusing on one of the really cool verses in Scripture, Romans 10:4, where it says that Jesus is the end of the law for righteousness. Now, I'm sure a lot of you got that on a plaque over your fireplace, stuff like that. We're actually going to talk about what does he mean? How does that fit in this whole topic of, go back to the end of 8, we're very much assured that we are going to go to heaven. God is 100% faithful. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. But we do need to talk about where Israel is because they're not responding to the gospel. What's up with that? So we spent all of 9 where Paul just was very, very clear. God is the one who chooses who will know him. So the topic of the doctrine of election comes from chapter 9 in Romans. That's where it comes from. And he's very clear about it. You remember Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. We talked about the comparison of Moses and Pharaoh. Every single time, Paul drove home the point, God is the one who chooses. It's not up to man who works or runs. So now we're at that point in chapter 10 where he says, let's go back now and look at, well, how is man responding to this? If God is the one who makes the choice, what's happening with man? What's man's side of this salvation story? So we pick up real quick, turn to chapter 9 so we can just look at what happens. So he's made this, Paul's been very, very clear. Let me point out 2 things at the end of chapter 9, verse 29. He has been very clear about the topic that it is God's choice who is called, who responds to the call. Many are called, few are chosen. But the other thing he pointed out was he used the remnant language, then verse 27 of chapter 9. So he brought up the point, look, just because the promise is very, very broad does not mean the fulfillment is the way man sees it. When I make a promise, I see how that promise is going to work out and who is going to receive that promise. So that's in that, he quotes from Isaiah and at the end of chapter 29. And I just point these things out because as we go through chapter 10, it's a very difficult thing to figure out, why do men respond? Why don't they respond? That's what we get to talk about for the next 3 or 4 weeks in chapter 10. So that's kind of the background. All right, so let's pick up. Verse 30, chapter 9. What shall we say then, that Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith, but Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as though it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. So I want to point out that the very first thing that Brother Paul does after he's laid out this perspective, salvation from God's perspective, I'm the one that chooses. He comes back to this question of, well, when you look at salvation history, the most well-documented people in God's favor is Israel. And yet, Israel didn't respond in faith. They are, to this day, following works. That's his point there at the end of chapter 9. And you think to yourself, well, now, wait a minute. Why is that? And all of chapter 10, we get to ask ourselves, Paul, are you really answering the question, or are you just leaving me with more balls in the air here about how this works? So I just want to be open about what's going on. The first thing that Paul brings up after this great chapter on 9 is, let's go back and consider that Gentiles who weren't even looking for God, remember Romans 1:21 through 29, many scholars think that's about the Gentiles. I think I told you at the time, I'm convinced it's the Jews and the Gentiles there. But the point is, think about the people in Romans 1. They're not looking for God. They've been given to their own way, right? Remember, it says at the end of chapter 1, not only do they themselves know what they're doing is wrong, they actually applaud people who do it. Okay, so he's saying those people are coming to God by faith. So here's a group that doesn't know God, wasn't seeking God, couldn't even spell his name. They're responding in faith. Here's another people, 1,800 years of a history of a personal relationship with God, and they're not. Now, if you're paying attention at all, you got to ask yourselves, how is that working? And we need to try and understand it in the context of what he's told us in chapter 9. God is the one. He's the potter. He is the one preparing the vessels of mercy. All right? So just want to be upfront. This is not easy walking through here. There's some famous verses that'll be in the Bible drill. Where's Gigi? Clovis. Yeah, there'll be some great verses in the Bible drill out of chapter 10. But understanding how they fit. People over here that are in Romans 1, just the worst of the worst, and everybody else are responding to the gospel. The people over here who've had a relationship for 1,800 years are still in works. So I just want to set that up, because when we come to verse 4 tonight, we need to be kind of aware of where Paul's mind is. All right. So a little bit of lengthy introduction. How are we doing? Look at the... Yeah. Okay. He hadn't ripped his headphones off and thrown them at the camera. That's always a good sign. Okay. So we're looking at... I'm going to throw out, and these aren't the only questions, but these are 5 questions that I think if you just contemplate that chapter 9 is God's truth. He says, this is me. I'm the potter. You are clay. You do not get to tell me whether you get handles. You do not get to tell me what I'm going to do with you. I'm the potter. Chapter 9. It's a beautiful chapter. We come to, okay, let me just throw out some questions. This is now from man's perspective. I've learned all this. So these are Larry questions. Well, okay, you choose God. Well, how does believing come about? Just broadly. What brings that about? Another question is, well, why do some hear with understanding and other people don't? Where does understanding come from? I don't mean to offend anybody, but why do we pray for people to be saved? If you believe chapter 9, why are you praying for people to be saved? Huh? You know, if God chooses, if the potter's the one that says that's a vessel of honor, a vessel of mercy, and that one's not, why are you praying for people? That's a tough question. You may love people, but if you believe chapter 9, you have to accept the potter is the one that fashions the vessels of mercy. You don't have to answer these questions tonight. What?
Because he told us to.
Oh, look at, okay, he's got the earphones on and they're working. You're correct, Gene. But we still need to ask ourselves, how does this work? Okay, here's another one. Is Van Cat still here? This is one of, I think, Van Cat's favorite verses. One time, Paul was writing to this friend of his, and he said, God will have all men be saved, believe, and come to the knowledge of truth. Well, why doesn't that happen? Right? Paul said that to Timothy. Why isn't that happening? Okay. Again, you don't have to answer the questions. I'm just throwing them out there so you're thinking.
It has something to do with free will.
Oh, maybe. Foy has tossed the free will card on the table. So, Clovis, you can keep yours in your pocket because Foy's gone ahead and turned his face up. The Texas Hold'em game has started, and Foy has gone face up on the free will card. Okay, and then here's a good one. So, do innocent people go to the lake of fire?
There are no innocent people.
Well played, Clovis. But we're going to come to these questions, and there are going to be some more that you're going to ask, but I put 5 out there just as, okay. So as I've told you, we're going to come eventually as we walk through our verses tonight to verse 4, where we're going to hear this phrase, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes, or for everyone who believes. And we're going to need to kind of ask ourselves some questions about, well, does that mean that you do have to go through that process of the law? Somehow that has to get in your life before you can come to Christ? Well, that can't be right, because I just told you the bulk of the people that are coming to Christ are these people that were as far away from God as you could get, right? The Gentiles. So we're going to have to wrestle through to try and understand, well, where's Paul coming from? Why bring, what's going on? What has been going on with the Jews for 1,800 years? What's happening now that Jesus is here? And how are these people that weren't even looking for God, why are they listening? Where did they get understanding? Who's praying for them? Do you think the Jews are praying for the Gentiles? True question. Where's Clovis? No, not a chance. There's no chance, right? So that's why I ask you the question. Who's praying? Oh, okay. Dave has chosen to just toss a coin in the air that says maybe Paul's praying for him. Okay, but fair enough. Okay, Foy, you can go to Bible drill, but let's just stay with it here. All right, so here we go. Whoa, sorry. No bending down, Larry. So we've read our opening text from chapter 9. Now let me read the first 4 verses of chapter 10. Brethren, my heart's desire for my prayer to God for them is for their salvation. Let me read that again, because some of you are trying to figure out this prayer question. Brethren, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them is for their salvation. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. For not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. I know a lot of you came tonight thinking we would get all the way through chapter 10. It isn't going to happen. We will struggle to get to verse 4. So let's look. First cab off the rank, verse 1. Who brought young Dave? If Jill was here, she'd mark you down for extra points. Look at verse 1 of chapter 10. Brethren, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them is for their salvation. Now, this is the guy who just wrote chapter 9. He knows all about that potter and clay thing. He knows all about these verses in Israel about the remnant language, right? He knows, I mean, what did I tell y'all? There's like over 65 references to the remnant in the prophets of Israel. And this guy, Gamaliel, was just drilling this in his head. So Paul knows this, and it's, I think, significant about his understanding of who God is and who he is now as an adopted child. He actually says, and Deanna used these words, my prayer to God for them is for their salvation. Why is he doing that? You all paid your money. You came in the room tonight. And he wrote chapter 9. I mean, the ink is still, well, whatever it is they were using is still wet on the papyrus. Yes, Clovis?
You got to look at his heart's desire.
Well, absolutely. And that's why I say, like Deanna said, there's love. That's why you pray for people, because you love them, right?
Right.
So I agree with you. It's heart desire. I just want you to get your mind around some people when they, and I'll lift the veil a little bit here. Some of my questions are geared towards a lot of times when people hear chapter 9 about the fact that God has said, I am the potter and I am the one that decides who gets handles on their pots and who doesn't, and which pot goes where. That's my decision. But a lot of them just think, well, that makes me a robot. And I want you to kind of think from these questions, there is a created in his image aspect of every chosen child of God that is really beyond what we understand. And this verse 1 is telling you one of them. That Paul, even though he knows there's a remnant of Israel that will be saved, even though he knows the potter makes the pots and picks where the pot goes, he's praying for his people to be saved. And he is saved. So I just want to say up front, do not take the truths of chapter 9 and run from them in fear. They are true, and that is who God is. But the response of the believer, the response of the child of God to the unsaved is that they be saved. Okay? So, okay, even if you're scared of chapter 9, you would like to white it out. Don't. That's who God is, and the believer is praying. Jane?
Who are the brethren? Are they the believers in Rome? Who would the brethren be?
Yeah, so Jane is asking about the very first word in verse 1, chapter 10. And at least in NASB, it starts brethren. And so, yes, he's talking about believers through the ages. In this case, the people sitting in these churches or church there in Rome that are hearing Phoebe read. But from a church age standpoint, right, this is the revelation of the gospel until we're raptured.
Larry?
Here it is. So, absolutely. So, all right, so now, verse 2. Is everybody okay with that? That's just something that you got to ask yourself.
Larry,
Yes.
what about where it says it's not God's will that any should perish?
Yes. So what did you?
Where it says it's not God's will that any should perish.
That's right.
He wants all to be saved, right?
That's right. So we got two choices, Clovis, because I guaranteed that the floor would be open, and for 4 weeks we'd get to talk about everything. However, we have to get through chapter 4 tonight. So we're going to table his question, but that question is live. Write that down on that desk right there in permanent marker so that next week you can bring that up. Charles will dial in again, and we are going to talk about these verses like who will have all men to be saved and to come under the knowledge of the truth. You know, he doesn't want anybody to go to hell. How does that work? If I just read you chapter 9, he's the potter.
Yeah, but we're talking about the clay.
What? Sorry, you have to wait. Foy's trying to jump on your horse here and ride it around the room.
Well, no, mine's more like a mule.
Yeah, well, okay. I don't want that braying. I've got to get through verse 4. So I need you. I know these are just, but you have to hold on because there's going to be a point where we can talk about those with a little bit more information. So sorry to have to put that off. We really need to figure out in the beginning of 10 here, Paul says, I bear them witness, they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. So one of the things he tells us is, all right, they don't have knowledge. Hold that thought. As some people say, we're going to circle back to that. And we're actually going to do that tonight. We're going to circle back tonight. What does it mean, not according to knowledge?
Oh, but he doesn't say they don't have knowledge. He says their zeal is not in accordance with knowledge.
Right, and that's we're going to talk about how can that be? Because I would submit to you, there is nobody who had a better open book exam chance than Israel. And we're actually going to go over their open book material to figure out how in the world is he saying this? Not in accordance with knowledge. Okay, what does he mean by that? Hang on, because we're going to go over the list. Okay, he goes on to say even more. Verse 3, for not knowing, there's that knowledge word again, about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. So, what is it that they don't know? It's in that verse, I promise.
They don't know who the righteousness of God is. They don't know Christ.
Those are all excellent answers. Young Dave Posey is thrown up. They don't know who the righteousness of God is. Foy has said they don't know Christ, and Fred has his hand in the air. Yes.
They don't know that salvation is by grace, not by works.
Okay, so Fred has encapsulated it with an Ephesians quote, kind of. They don't know that God's righteousness is by grace through faith. All right.
Are we mainly
So-
talking about Jews?
Say again.
Are we mainly talking about the Jewish people here?
Yes, yes. Oh, not mainly, only.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm with
Yeah,
you.
yeah. These first 4 verses, when Paul talks about the brethren that he's writing to are believers, the people he's talking about are these Jews that just aren't responding. You know, all the way back to the start of chapter 9. Here we are in 10, and he's still saying it. This is just heavy on his heart. So now, right, he's laid out the point that Israel, he really wants them to be saved. They're very zealous, just like he was on the road to Damascus. And to be fair, well, I'm not going to get ahead of myself. They are just as zealous about God as Paul considered him to be himself to be zealous when he's heading to Damascus to bring this rebellious sect into compliance. It was ridiculous what these people were saying about this dead guy. That A, he was Messiah, and B, he was alive. I mean, that was just ridiculous. So he had letters, right? That's his definition of zeal. Okay? I am going to Damascus. I am going to quash this rebellious error. So he's saying that's where they are. And he's also saying that their knowledge is not consistent with God's righteousness. He says that again in verse 3, right? For not knowing about God's righteousness. And we've had various, that's grace, faith, that's Jesus, right? And seeking to establish their own. They did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. So what are 2 things that Israel, to this day, is exhibiting? It's open table. Pick up the mic. What? He says right there. Okay. They don't know about God's righteousness. Paul's made that clear. So what have they done?
Well, they're exhibiting the same thing that their forefathers had the problem with. They're stiff-necked.
Yes. Foy is saying they're stiff.
They're
Yep.
traditionalists. They're relying on tradition. This is the way it's been done. And they're stiff-necked because it's not happening the way that they anticipated it would happen.
Yeah, yep. Okay,
Jesus gave him a parable that explained it. And that is, the farmer had this great farm, and he had let it out to tenants, and the tenants were just robbing him blind, so he said, I'm gonna send my son down there to fix it. So he sent his son, and they killed him.
yeah. Dave's quoting the parable Jesus teaches about the unrighteous tenants.
They can't get past killing Jesus.
Yeah. Now, Fred?
The answer is in chapter 9, 32a.
Yeah, they don't pursue it by faith, but the problem, yeah, they don't do it by faith, they do it by works. 100% agree. That's why we started back there tonight. They are on the works doing, but look at where he's gotten us to in verse 3 of chapter 9. Seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. So they do two things. They come up with their own way that they are going to be righteous, and they will not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. This is a very strong indictment against them. So let's think about how has this happened. So turn to, I want to kind of look at, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's the list that's in Romans of where where the Jews should be, where they were from the beginning. So go to Romans 3:1. Romans 3:1, then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the benefit of circumcision? And that means national choice. Verse 2, great in every respect, first of all. And that doesn't necessarily mean first in rank. It's saying of great importance. It's like 1 Corinthians 15. They were entrusted with the oracles of God. Now, we're going to expand that in a minute, but before we do, go to chapter 9, and let's read that verse. So in chapter 3, verse 1 or 2, he says they were entrusted with the oracles of God. So in chapter 9, he's introduced his grief over Israel. So go to verse 4, because we're going to just fast forward here. Verse 4. So he's talking about his kinsmen who are Israelites, to whom belongs the adoption as sons. I mean, they were actually a chosen people. They weren't just this random group that were part of a club. I mean, they're a chosen people, right? So they've been adopted. And the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the temple service. And some of you may have worship in that verse, which is an excellent meaning of what they mean by temple service. And the promises. And whose are the fathers, and from whom is the Christ according to the flesh, who is over all, God bless forever. Now, we haven't got time to expand every reference in Scripture about the benefits of being a Jew, but Paul has encapsulated a few things. What would you think the oracles are? Huh? Sayings?
The law.
Well, okay. Phil has brought up the prophets, but I want you to really be thinking about God personally. So this is talking about God has personally spoken to these guys. And do we know that to be true?
All of the information that he gave to the Jews was oracles.
Yeah, I grant you. If you were to pin Paul down, Dave, he would agree with you that the law, the prophets, the wisdom books, yes, that's all of God. He probably even believes all Scripture is inspired by God. But at this point, he's trying to tell you, why is this people so unique? God spoke with these people. I'm sure you all have played the DVD of At the Mountain, when they first show up at the mountain, and God actually comes down on that mountain. The mountain begins to break up because of who he is, and he speaks to them. And they know that God speaks directly to Moses on their behalf. So I just want to point out, when it comes to oracles, just be thinking, this is a people who have personally heard from God.
They've not only been personally heard from, they were personally challenged by.
Well, we're coming to that one. Thank you very much. But that's good. I appreciate you being, yeah. So the first one is he spoke to them. All right. So go to chapter 9, verse 4. This is the one Foy talks about. To whom belongs the adoption as sons. They were personally chosen. This is actually, he has said, you are mine. I have chosen you, right? So, all right, the glory. What is that about? We're still in verse 4, chapter 9. Online, you're welcome to buzz in, but what is the glory? When God says, I've spoken to you, and I know you guys haven't thought about this, but you're going to tonight, so we'll go ahead and say it. Not only did they verbally have him speak to them, he wrote with his finger on tablets for them. And that's going to come up in the giving of the law. So, I mean, he's very personal about communicating with them. All right, so the adoption is theirs. They're chosen. What is the glory?
But what popped in my head was thinking about when he left Egypt. I mean, he did all these things that with the plagues and everything, he said, why did he do it? Because of his glory.
Yeah, and Foy is pointing out there is glory in the testimony of what he did. And we talked about Rahab and the fact that Rahab came to Christ because of what happened with Pharaoh.
There were witnesses to all of this stuff going through there. I mean, up close and personal.
But
They had the shining evidence of God present.
the Shekinah glory is what he's talking about. And he's talking about the fact, that's right, by day, they knew he was there. By night, they knew he was there. All right? So, all right, keep going. I promised I wouldn't make this too long, and I've already done it. All right, so after the glory is the covenants. So those are, now this, Dave, is, if you're the one that said this, I can't remember, but yes, and even what Philip was talking about. Through the whole revelation of God to Israel, through the years, through the generations, through the various covenants, from Abraham to Jacob to David, right? All right, so they have been involved with a God who's personally making promises to them about what's going to happen. Go into the land. If you obey me, you'll prosper here. Be here forever. I mean, they're getting personal commitments here. Okay. We talked about the giving of the law. That's this cool, if you really stop and think about it, that's a handwritten document by God on a rock. It doesn't get any sweeter than that. Not only did he verbally, the oracles of God, they've got God's handwriting. I mean, so anyway, and we'll come back to the law in a minute, but not only is the way, because he says the giving of the law, that's why I'm talking about the fact that the act of the giving is what Paul is focusing on here, not necessarily the content of the law. And the giving was a very personal handwritten deal, right? It's like getting a text. Well, maybe not. All right. The temple service, which I said is the worship, these are the only people in history that have been said, this is in fact how you worship me. This is right worship. Maybe you don't like praise bands. God had praise bands. Maybe you don't like whatever. He actually said to Israel, this is how you worship the God of the ends of the earth. And you're going to do it. And all the earth is going to know that's right. He's saying, you guys have that. Talking to his own people, right? And then he says, and this is perhaps going to lead us into verse 4. He says, you guys are the human line of Messiah. Now, I know that's a huge, that's beyond our grasp, the significance of those things, but I just want you to stop for a second and say, all right, I told you this group over here, the Gentiles, the Romans 1:21 through 32, they're turning to Christ everywhere the gospel goes. The people we just talked about, oracles, adoption, covenants, promises, the finger of God, worship. This is the songbook you use. The whole enchilada over here, nothing, almost nothing. I mean, Paul says, well, yeah, I believed, but I mean, it's so rare to have Jewish Christians that there's comes towards the end of his life, he's writing and he says, only these two guys from the circumcision, referring to Jewish believers, are with me. I mean, he's glad to have all these Gentile men that he's discipled and they're going out and working. But he looks at the end of his life, he can name a couple of guys. They're just not happening. So that's where we are. You really have to be letting your mind get around the potter's making the pots. What's going on with the people who had everything are not responding, and the people who weren't even looking, remember chapter 9, verse 30, who did not pursue righteousness, attained righteousness. He's talking about the Gentiles. How's that happening? That's enough of a pregnant pause. We have to go on. But I want you to think about how did Israel get there? I just told you everything they had. So, you talk about an open book exam, there's no way you fail. You got these handwritten tablets over here, right? You're going to get the first 10 on the quiz right anyway. He's talked to you. You know how to worship him. How in the world, and the Messiah is from you. How in the world do you not know him when he shows up? Boy has tossed sin into the answer bowl. Okay.
Pride.
Let me give you if you look at verse 3, he tells us three things that Israel is guilty of. They don't know about God's righteousness, which we've talked about. Grace through faith, right? It's faith. You have to believe that God is the potter. He's the only one that can save you. And however he saves you, that's how you get saved. The interesting thing, this is the one that I think is verse 3, seeking to establish their own. So they don't know what God's righteousness is, but they seek to establish their own. They did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. So when you look at Israel and you're there at the mountain and you're Cecil B. DeMille, Charlton Heston has gone up and you're filming. What are you filming there at the mountain while Charlton Heston has gone up to get this finger on the tablet thing?
They built the camp.
Absolutely. And why did they do that?
They had to have something.
That's right. Jane is on a flow here. She says, why did they do that? Because they're idolatrous people and they needed an idol. So they said to Aaron, we need an idol. Of course, we all know Aaron's silly answer to Moses, how they got it, but right? That's who they are. So when everything I just told you was happening, Romans 3:1, Romans 9:4 and 5, all these things happen. Not all of them happen at the mountain, but some big ones do, right? The oracles, the finger on the tablet, all these miracles getting taken out of Egypt and crossing the Red Sea. I mean, they've got a good starting point. Why? What's wrong?
Does it not answer right there in verse 3? In my book, the Bible is the fourth word, ignorance. They were ignorant. Well, they said, they being ignorant of God's righteousness.
Okay, but how is that possible? I'm going to give you a homework assignment.
Well, it's contained in that word.
I think, well,
In the Greek, it can also mean to ignore.
it can mean to ignore. I would submit to you the answer is in the third phrase. They did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. They rebelled. No, because they're sinners. All right, so we will come to what you two are talking about. Later in chapter 10, Paul is going to talk about why do some people hear and some people don't hear. Because there's one thing you can't say about Israel. We know they heard because when the mountain shook and God talked to them, what was the first thing they said? Stop, no more of that. You go talk to him and tell us what he said. And then as soon as he left, what did they do?
From the time that God called them to the time that Christ came, how many years was it?
Well, from Abraham's call to Christ, we'll say 1,800 years.
1,800 years, he poured his heart out, wooing these people to his righteousness, and they refused him at every corner.
They did.
And they
Not only
killed,
once, but how many times?
I don't have a count, but Dave is pointing out, just in summary, Israel's rebellion was from Egypt when they, even if you go back and read the early scripts of the play about the Exodus, you know, it's in there that they say, would you please stop going to him? Because every time you ask for something, he makes our job harder. Remember that? They said, would you please quit talking to Pharaoh? I'm not going to make bricks without straw. I got to go get my own straw. So Israel, and so here's your homework, so I don't forget it. You get to go to the Romans of the Old Testament, Deuteronomy. You get to go to Deuteronomy 9 and 9 and 10. So do Deuteronomy 9 and 10 and Deuteronomy 30. Deuteronomy 9 and 10 and Deuteronomy 30. And read that and see what Moses is saying to them. Now, I grant you, it's at the end of the 40 years, but it's at the start of going into the promised land. So if you're looking at 1,800 years, this is like still pretty much at the beginning. And it's a new generation, right? The first generation has died because they rebelled and wouldn't go into the land. So this is now the next generation. So he's given them the same speeches. He recites the law. But read those chapters and ask yourself, can I really say that Israel did not know? Because this is the ignorance. They're trying to argue the ignorance card. Read Deuteronomy 9 and 10 and read Deuteronomy 30 and see if Moses says, you don't know.
Well, yeah, I agree with Gary when he says out of that is not that they wouldn't hear what was being said and what happened. It's the fact that they chose to ignore it through their hard-heartedness.
And that I'll give you, but I want you to look at what it really says, because there's going to be some phrasing in that Deuteronomy text that we're going to see it picks up in verse 6. And you can see by the clock, Dave has not stood up yet, but I have once again failed to even get to the verse for tonight, right? So we can either stay for another hour and do verse 4 or come back next week.
and they even ridiculed and killed
His only son.
the ones that God sent to help guide them along.
Oh, every prophet. Yep, as Jesus says, every prophet dies.
His only son.
Yeah. So read those, because next week, Gary,
Could you repeat those references? Because I was looking at something else.
so Deuteronomy 9 and 10
I thought you said 30.
and Deuteronomy 30. So look at your clay tablet there very closely. Make sure, Foy, you've got them. So read that, because next week, when we come back to once again start with verse 4, we are going to go into Paul quoting that text as an interesting proof point about believers today. So I want you to have read it in the context. Moses talking to those guys right before the last camp meeting. They're getting ready to cross. And Moses says language that Paul is going to pick up and apply to the righteousness that is by faith. Now, I apologize, I didn't get to 4 tonight, so we will go through Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. We really need to understand that because there's this big transition that needs to happen. Do you need to go through the law to come to Christ? And we've got to get through that because the church age is hinging on whether this is a requirement. So that's kind of setting up what we'll do. We'll start with verse 4 and go into verses that pull from the Deuteronomy homework. I know you're all going to go home and read it. So thank you for that.
They preferred Barabbas rather than the Lord Jesus.
Dave, yeah. Well, we will look as closely as we can to understand what is it about the human heart that God can talk to you, can write you instructions with his own hand, tell you how to worship him, make promises to you, adopt you nationally as his children, and you still choose to ignore and follow your own way. What is it about that?
We're given a whole Bible with all kinds of instructions, and we know a lot of them, but do we follow them?
Well, we're going to talk about, so this, we're back to the same question. Where does this faith and believing thing come from? Because I hope from tonight you at least take away having an open book test or material does not guarantee you faith. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. So if nothing else, when you get home tonight, you say to yourself, you know, being Jewish would not bring me to Christ. All right, let me pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for your grace. We do not understand the hand of the Father in all that he does to say everyone that he has chosen will be conformed to your image and will be in eternity with you to see the glory you have had from the beginning with the Father. But it's going to happen. And we thank you for that. Amen. So, yes,